sometimes when we have very special guests, as we do today, it takes just a little bit of time to wiggle both of our schedules to fit an interview in. And I am delighted that we are finally going to talk to the man that I will introduce to you in just a moment, because we've been trying to make this happen for a couple of weeks now. But listen, you and I know we are partners in this endeavor on the Liz Wheeler Show, and we on the Liz Wheeler Show have been on the forefront for the past couple of months now of covering the networks of violent leftist groups in our country. Now, we know that these groups, when they take to the streets, it's not an organic protest. It's not a grassroots gathering of citizens airing their grievances against the government. It's nothing of the kind. These are highly coordinated, tied together, meaning connected. They are funded, these groups, by billionaires like communist Roy Singham and God-hating George Soros. And the umbrella of these groups, all of these groups together, and there are dozens and dozens of groups, from the People's Forum to the Party of Socialism and Liberation, to the John Brown Gun Club, to Armed Queers of Salt Lake City, to Behind Enemy Lines, so many of them. Those are just a couple that we've covered in the last couple months. They serve as a structure of camouflage for Antifa terrorists. Now, you know that Antifa, of course, loves to claim that they're a decentralized network. They have no organizational structure, no leadership. They're not really a group, they like to say, or at least that's what their mouthpieces in the mainstream media tell you. They're an idea. We have proved this to be demonstrably false. The umbrella of radical leftist groups that I mentioned, those names and many more, allow Antifa to exist quietly beneath them, like slugs under a rock. These groups, these leftist groups, provide Antifa militants quietly with resources, with training, with mobilization, and yes, with funding. All without Antifa poking their heads above ground. Until, of course, the Antifa militants wage their terror attacks against us. Now, one man in particular has been in the thick of it, on the front lines, infiltrating these violent thugs, these groups, for years to report on who they are and how they work and what their goals are, how they intend to subvert our country and harm you. And he suffered for it. In 2019 in Portland, Oregon, journalist Andy Ngo was brutally attacked by Antifa militants, sustaining a traumatic brain injury, a brain hemorrhage, as a result of that assault. He was then assaulted again by Antifa in 2021. They recognized him when he was reporting on one of their public riots. He was chased, he was attacked, he was beaten by a masked mob. He ended up ultimately fleeing to the Nines Hotel, where the mob surrounded the hotel, chanting and demanding his blood. Nobody has been closer to Antifa and reporting on the reality of what Antifa is, how they work, how to dismantle them, and what ultimately Antifa wants to do to our country than independent journalist Andy Ngo. And I am delighted to introduce you to him today. He's the author, of course, of a must-read book, Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. If you want to understand this group, you will read that book. He also writes at a very cheekily titled Substack, No Comment, spelled like his last name, ngocomment.com. Highly recommend his reporting over there. Andy, it is good to see you. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me on and for that introduction, Liz.
All right, so there's been a significant update. We know, of course, that President Trump designated Antifa as a terror organization. We all kind of sat back and said, okay, how is this going to play out? Like, what are the implications of this designation? And I think, Andy, you had an article recently that I'd like you to explain to us about the first Antifa terrorism convictions that we've seen following the Antifa attack, the shooting on the ICE facility in Alvarado, Texas. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a summary of what that attack was, who it was carried out by, and what these terrorism convictions mean in this fight against Antifa, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, so I think I should discuss, like, how did we get to this point? So backtracking to September, a few days after Charlie Kirk was murdered, Donald Trump announced on Truth Social that his administration would be treating Antifa as domestic terrorists. And my sentiment at that time was, let's wait and see what this means. Because in 2020, a very similarly worded statement was posted on Trump's Twitter at that time. And Attorney General Barr and his administration in the last months that it was in office didn't do anything on that. But a lot has happened since that announcement in September. This time is very different. So there was a roundtable on Antifa at the White House, in which I was invited to speak face to face with the president, as well as other journalists who were invited, and members of his cabinet were there. There were 2 executive orders that he signed, basically formalizing in writing what he had wanted, that was first written in the Truth Social post. And then there were the foreign terrorist organization designations by the State Department on 4 international Antifa groups that have been involved in shootings, bombings, attempted murders in Europe. And then the most recent update is that in Texas, there's been an ongoing Antifa terror cell case, and that's being prosecuted at both the federal and the state level. And as of last week, 5 of 9 indicted members of the cell have pleaded guilty. And if you read the federal indictment against them, the DOJ does not mince any words. They're particularly North Texas Antifa cell. And in the stipulated facts as part of pleading guilty, which means that they agreed that these are the facts of the case, and they signed their names to it as part of the plea deal. They admitted to being part of an organized cell that organized around the Antifa ideology, and they were involved in a affinity group. And that's all the words of Antifa. That's how they describe their organized groups. And the 5 of them were convicted of providing material support to terrorists. And I cannot overstate how significant of a development this is. This is the first time, like in a period of 2 weeks, we had like 2 first time evers in the US history. We have, for the first time, the State Department formalizing that 4 Antifa groups internationally were terrorists on the level now officially designated like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. These are official designations from State Department. And then a federal case in Texas has resulted in terrorism convictions. So far, 5 people. At least 1 more is going to plead guilty. And there's a total of 18 defendants in this case. So it'll work its way through the courts. Also, they're also facing terrorism charges at the state level in Texas too, by the way. So, I'm just like, finally, we have this. At the same time, we're not seeing any coverage on liberal media. And I doubt that the minds of liberals who defend Antifa, that say that they're good guys or that they don't exist, their minds probably won't be changed. I mean, it wasn't changed when an Antifa gunman shot up an ICE facility in 2019 and tried blowing it up in Tacoma, Washington. It didn't change their mind. When a Trump supporter was assassinated by an Antifa gunman in downtown Portland in 2020, it didn't change their mind. When I was nearly killed several times, and other people have been maimed and injured through the streets of America. So I don't think these convictions will change their minds. But at least whenever they say that Antifa won't exist, well, I mean, I can direct them to the guilty pleas and the stipulated facts, and then you can read what those who have pleaded guilty admitted to.
Well, that's the interesting part. And I think it's 2 separate fights, right? Changing the American people's hearts and minds over what Antifa is and the threat that they pose. That's sort of one fight. And you're correct. The mainstream media obviously just runs cover for Antifa. They're like, Antifa's an idea. They're the wind. They don't exist. We know the mainstream media is propagandists. And this is like evil propaganda level to cover for actual terrorists. But the legal precedent that is set by not just the convictions, but the stipulated facts, if you are looking at, the FBI and the Department of Justice, the Trump administration, the State Department, actually taking action against Antifa, we've had a lot of, those of us who talk about Antifa have had a lot of discussions behind the scenes, like, how do you actually dismantle Antifa? What's the best strategy? Because of what a convoluted structure they operate within, sort of under the umbrella of these other radical leftist groups. They do trainings for Antifa militants, but they have this plausible deniability because they're not necessarily members on the roster. They get money because they co-host events, or they are just mobilized together, but they do try to camouflage themselves by not having like an official, like incorporated LLC type of structure, so that they can avoid being dismantled. But when it comes to the most effective way of actually dismantling not just the ideology, but these individuals who are obviously part of this coordinated structure committing violence against the country, how significant of a legal precedent is it to have these stipulated facts, these statements that the defendants who pleaded guilty agreed were accurate and signed their names to?
So I'm not sure if it sets precedent in the courts, but it may set precedents in the current Department of Justice, in that they are not afraid of shying away from using the word Antifa in press releases, criminal indictments, and making sure, particularly like those who have been handling it in the Northern District of Texas have been amazing in that, like in the stipulated facts, for example, they could have not included Antifa. They could have just said that this was a violent extremist group, something like that. We typically saw language like that, or even none of that included in prior plea deals at the federal level involving far less violent extremists. But no, in this case, it was like the Antifa ideology was mentioned specifically and clearly at the beginning of the stipulated facts. And also, I need to mention that these are people who are not being convicted of terrorism crimes because of ideology or speech. They admitted to being part of a cell that carried out an ambush shooting on an ICE facility in the Fort Worth area of Texas on the 4th of July. They used fireworks to lure out officers and agents and staff inside the ICE building, and then fired upon them. And one local police officer was shot in the neck. So this is not about ideology. It's about acts of domestic terrorism.
Yeah, the ideology is the motivating force, but it's not their belief system that they're being convicted for. It's the violence that they committed. You also, in your article, talk about the defense fund that raised, the International Antifa Defense Fund, that raised money for these defendants who pled guilty in this terror case. Talk to me about that, because that's something that I think I was unsure when the Trump administration started talking about designating Antifa as a terror group. Well, how are you going to do this? Are you going to call them a foreign terror organization because there are affinity groups all around the world, because the Antifa ideology didn't originate here? How are you going to connect that? You'd have to have a financial connection to the affinity groups here in the United States in order to designate them as international or as a foreign terror organization. If you designate them as a domestic terror organization, what power does that give you to dismantle them? I was a little bit unsure about how they were going to step around that. But talk to me about the international money that's flowing to these individuals and the implications of that.
So most of the funding for organized militant Antifa cells and their riots is done through what they call mutual aid, which is their fancy word for basically crowdfunding. They're extremely good at that. And it's not even particularly hidden. They will set up Cash Apps and Venmos and campaigns on GoFundMe or a number of other sites and distribute these links online across their vast online networks, and the money comes pouring in. Most of that is domestic. However, there is an international element to some of those who have been involved in Antifa violence at the international level. For example, there's a group called Antifa International, and one of the projects they run is the International Antifa Defense Fund. I wrote about them years ago in my book about Antifa because I saw, there's a case of prosecution of Antifa in this part of America or in Europe or in this other country. And they had their hands all over it in providing funding for the legal aid in that. And I wanted to know a bit more about how they work. And if you go on the blog for Antifa International, you can see that some of the members that they've highlighted have been individuals who have gone abroad to do terrorism training. Like they will actually post pictures of them holding up weapons of war and various firearms in places like Syria, to show that their members have been trained at the military level to kill. So I mentioned to the White House at the roundtable that the foreign terror organization is very important because it's at the State Department that they could, for example, ban Antifa International. Now, so far, that has not been one of the groups that has been banned out of the four. However, it's my understanding through my sources that the four that have been banned so far are not going to be the only ones. So we'll wait and see. Antifa International and the defense fund that they run did provide funding to the legal defense of the 18 defendants so far in this North Texas Antifa terror case. And we don't know who these international people are, foreign people who's providing money. And there's also a Give, Send, Go that's being operated for the Antifa terror defendants. And now some of them are convicts as well.
Which is, again, I can't help but juxtapose the facts against what the mainstream media always tells us. And it's not just the mainstream media. Elected Democrats say the same thing. Antifa is just an idea. They're a decentralized network. This is just grassroots. This is just people that have grievances against the government. Yeah, the international figures, you don't even know who they are sending money to defend acts of terror in the United States. That is not a decentralized network. That's just an idea that doesn't exist. I want to ask you too about another group. You've talked a lot about this group, and we covered this briefly a couple weeks ago on the Liz Wheeler show. We talked about, when you see an Antifa riot, especially outside of an ICE facility, you'll often see off to one side a group of individuals wearing green helmets. And the significance of those green helmets those are members of the National Lawyers Guild, and they essentially serve Antifa. When these Antifa militants commit crimes, they are there to observe, to video, to try to accuse police of police brutality. They basically are there to try to get Antifa militants off when Antifa militants commit crimes. And it is not just one or two or three of these people. This is an entire group. Can you talk to me about that group and who's behind that group and how exactly they're coordinated? Every time that Antifa turns out to riot, these green helmeted people are always there.
So the National Lawyers Guild is an old American legal organization. They're probably most well known for providing legal aid to accused communists historically in the US. And then in recent years, they've become known for being basically the legal arm of Antifa rioters. What they do is they show up at direct actions and riots, not to legally observe, which is what it says on their hats. What they're there to do is to provide legal support to their fellow comrades. And they've published on their own, not on their blog, on their website, and they're registered 501c3, by the way, with chapters at legal programs across universities across the US. They say that they don't condemn political violence or the use of violence in regards to the Antifa. So they are on record supporting criminal conduct whilst being legal observers and lawyers. So they exist to provide aid for anti-government causes and in support of the violent far left. Their latest project now is they've launched a website providing legal guidelines for how those in the military may be able to engage in seditious behavior by not following orders, for example. And they're laying out, this is sort of a blueprint for how you can argue that what you're doing is following the Constitution. So they exist to subvert. And when they're there years ago when I observed them on the ground, they wear neon green helmets. I thought that these were volunteers who were just trying to be independent observers for what was happening in a very volatile situation at riots. Then I noticed that their cameras were never directed at those who were engaging in criminal activity, like starting fires, and those who were beating people. The cameras were intentionally withheld and then only brought out and aimed directly at police whenever police showed up. And that was for gathering so-called evidence so that they could engage in lawfare if there were arrests, then they could sue cities and allege police brutality or unlawful arrest. And as I've written about before, that strategy is used to fund the rioting. A lot of how rioters are paid are through these lawsuits, because in liberal jurisdictions, they just settle. The city, the police department will not take it to trial. They'll pay out tens of millions to settle these mass lawsuits, and then those who are engaged in rioting get a payout. And that's the legacy, by the way, of the George Floyd BLM Antifa riots from 5 years ago.
It's unbelievable. The connections between the different plots that the left has or is actively engaging in right now is also, it just blows my mind on a daily basis. I mean, literally on the show yesterday, we talked about this video that was made by these 6 members of Congress, starring Senator Mark Kelly. Trump's been calling them the seditious 6 because in this video, they're encouraging military members to not comply with what they allege are unlawful orders without ever specifying what order they consider to be unlawful. It's obviously just trying to turn the military against the commander in chief. We talked about what that actually is, that it's these 6 members of Congress are all swamp creatures. They're either military, intel, national security apparatus, like deep state swamp creatures, and they are trying to foment a color revolution. An important part of a color revolution is to turn the military against the executive branch, the commander in chief, that chain of command. But it's wild to hear you talk about the National Lawyers Guild, this legal apparatus that defends Antifa and provides part of their funding through this lawfare, that they were actually the ones that wrote this blueprint, the playbook for the script that the seditious 6 spoke on this video. I think it was November 11th, the National Lawyers Guild released this blueprint telling military members to disobey orders. And then a week later, it's not a coincidence that it was only a week later that these members of Congress put out this same video. It is all so interconnected that, like I said, sometimes I have to do a double take at the connections because I'm like, really? That's connected to that? It's wild. Let me ask you this, and I know that this is a very open-ended, very big picture question, but when it comes to actually dismantling these violent radical leftist groups that adhere to Antifa ideology, even if the name of their particular group doesn't include Antifa, because oftentimes they have very vague names. If you're advising the Trump administration how to actually dismantle these groups, not play whack-a-mole and just convict people when they've committed violence, that's good, that's fine, that's serving justice, but we need to stop it before it starts, before it happens. What do you advise the Trump administration to do? Do you advise them to go after the leadership structure, the participants, the finances? How do we actually dismantle this apparatus?
Wow. Well, it would be extremely challenging just because of the fact that you said it basically is whack-a-mole. They can mobilize in a very nebulous form as masked anonymous individuals, or as those who form under a number of organization names that don't have Antifa in it. I would say immediately what can be done that doesn't require a huge amount of brainstorming and creativity is for the federal prosecutors to take on the cases, as many as they can. Don't leave it in the hands of the local state prosecution. I mean, in some places, the local prosecutions can do an amazing job, like in Texas, but that's not primarily where Antifa are active and violent. They thrive in places like Portland or Seattle, in other jurisdictions like that, because they know they can depend on the DA being politically pressured by the city to obscure the Antifa aspects of their organized crime, or to choose to not prosecute them. So immediately, I think it's just about the DOJ prosecuting and keeping it in there, making these federal cases. So I was encouraged that Pam Bondi took an interest, for example, in what happened a few weeks ago at the University of California, Berkeley. That jurisdiction fell in the Bay Area, but in their hands, nothing would happen. There's been a lot of rioting for almost a decade on that campus and in the surrounding areas by these same groups, like By Any Means Necessary, which is an Antifa group. So where any potential federal crimes have been committed, then the federal prosecutors need to take it. And I think that will do a big immediate dent.
Will that cause a deterrent effect? And I've been unsure of the answer to that question, because when you have ideologues, oftentimes they're willing to kill and be killed. They are not deterred by the punishment for the crime they commit, because they believe it's almost a mission-oriented ideological thing that they're doing. But do you believe that terror convictions like the one that we saw in Texas, will that have a deterrent effect?
I think it will, because we're seeing that now already in Portland, Oregon. So back in June and July, that was sort of the height of the rioting outside the ICE facility. But as more and more federal agents were surged there, and the federal attorney for the District of Oregon has been charging suspect after suspect. There's been dozens who have been charged at the federal level now, and these cases are not being dropped, by the way, including for lesser crimes in the past that they wouldn't have prosecuted, like trespass or disobeying a lawful order, things like that. It's made a lot of the rioters think twice about going back and trying to set the building on fire or assaulting other federal agents. Also, some of the Antifa chatter from the organized groups is they're afraid to go out because they know that area is heavily surveilled. So there is a deterrent effect. And you're right that they do, amongst the most extreme ideologues, believe that their cause is to kill, and if needed, to be martyred in the process as well. But when they're actually faced with a situation where they could be facing years or decades in federal prison, a lot of them have stepped back.
Their ideology wavers in the face of reality. Well, I think that's good for the Department of Justice to know as well. Last question about just this dismantling. Are there particular individuals that the Department of Justice would do well to go after that would have a sort of breakdown effect in the Antifa network, or particular affinity groups that take a leadership role that if they were dismantled, it would similarly cause this sort of trickle-down dismantling effect?
Yes, I've discussed this publicly. So one of the financiers of the International Antifa Defense Fund, and this is in his own words, by the way, this is not my allegation, is a Rutgers history professor named Mark Bray. Mark Bray is probably the most well-known spokesperson for violent Antifa, I would say. Whenever he's been interviewed now for going back to 2017, it's to give the Antifa position as well as to give justifications for the violence. And if you read his book, the Antifa Handbook, where he says that proceeds from that book will go to the Antifa Defense Fund, he also uses words like "we" to describe things about direct action. So he includes himself as a member and part of this violent movement. And he says that the goal in it is, if needed, to use violence to make those who have supported Donald Trump think twice about it. And he uses the word "we." So after the executive orders were signed recently by President Trump in relation to Antifa and far-left violent extremism, he fled out of the U.S. He says it was because he received threats online. I think that was a pretense. He went to Spain, which has a socialist government right now. And the timing is quite convenient that he left the U.S. as the State Department and the intelligence community is probing the international ties between Antifa terror groups domestically and those abroad.
And he should be one, you suggest, that the Trump administration pursues.
Well, if Antifa International becomes designated as a specially designated terrorist group or an FTO, then it would legally ban providing material support to it. And he has provided money to one of their projects, which is that defense fund. So,
seems like, in a sense, it seems like an easy win for the Department of Justice to significantly dismantle the structure. I mean, the structure, unfortunately, has been very successful. We've seen this violence erupt in cities across the country. You know this. I said this to you off air before we started, but You came on my show in 2019 after you had been assaulted by Antifa, after you had suffered a traumatic brain injury, a brain hemorrhage. And Andy, it caused me pain to hear you speak after that because you were so injured. It was hard for you to form words. It was hard for you to communicate, and to see how much you've healed, and how clearly all that you speak now, that the effects of that that you've overcome those, that violence, that assault on you. It makes me I'm so happy for you. I'm so glad, but you're also such a powerful force in educating everybody about Antifa through your courage in infiltrating these places and going and seeing and reporting on the reality. Again, I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but guys, you have to read his book. Highly recommend. It's called Unmasked. You can find it anywhere books are sold. Also, make sure you subscribe to Andy's Substack. It's a pun. It's called No Comment, ngocomment.com. But all the stuff he's talking about, he writes endlessly about. He's the source of much of my knowledge about Antifa. That's what I will say. So highly recommend it. Andy, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for being a friend to me and on this story now for so many years.
Of course, my pleasure. You're welcome back anytime. You know this. We'll talk soon. All right, guys, we have big break.